Alright, you guys, let's talk about federalism. We've talked about federalism and we talked about different government types, and we've talked about federalism with the Constitution, but we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about federalism itself. So the first section that we're going to be covering is dividing government power. Alright, so remember that federalism is a way of organizing our nation's government into different levels of government that share authority over the same land and people. So we have the state government and we have the national government. Those are our two governments. They're different levels, but they still share authority. Why do we need a federal system of government? If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government really did not have enough power to address the issues that affected the United States. And under the federal system, the government has the powers that it needs to function. If you take a look at this, I guess I would call it a graphic. Under the confederal system, the people give the states power, and then the states give the national government power. The national government does not have any interaction with the people, though. Under the federal system, the people give power to the states, but they also give power to the national government. And the states give power to the national government, but the national government also gives power to the state governments. So they all work together. The framers leaned heavily upon philosophers like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, and Adam Smith, who advocated for self-rule and limited government. They particularly liked the work of Baron de Montesquieu, which you need to make sure that you know. He believed that dividing power was the best way to defend the people's freedom from a too powerful government. The framers carefully divided powers between levels of government, between the state government and the national government. The framers assigned all the powers that had to do with the state's common interests to the national government, such as national defense and control over currency. Everything else was given to the states. These are some of the powers of the national government. The Constitution outlined a federal system that provides a strong national government and protects the states' rights. Now we're going to be talking about different powers. The first one is express powers, or we call them sometimes the enumerated powers. To enumerate means to list. So these are the powers that have been listed for the federal government in the Constitution. Some examples include, like for the legislative branch, they have the power to issue money, to pay government debt, to collect taxes, and to regulate trade. The executive branch, for example, has the power to command the armed forces. Those are listed in the Constitution. Next, you have implied powers. These are powers that are not listed in the Constitution, but are logical extensions of the expressed powers. The necessary and proper clause, we sometimes call that the elastic clause, gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into the execution the powers that they have listed in the Constitution. So Congress can make laws if they feel that it will help them execute their powers that they have been given. For example, an implied power would be building highways, regulating food, and collecting specific taxes like income tax, because the Constitution doesn't specifically list how Congress is supposed to collect taxes. So that's an implied power. Next is inherent powers. These are powers that have been historically recognized as belonging to the government because they are conducting the business of a sovereign nation. The U.S. government has inherent powers because it is a government. Examples would be the power to acquire new territory and the power to conduct foreign affairs. These are some examples of state powers. And the Federalist Papers, number 45, James Madison explains that the Constitution grants powers to the national government, and they are few and defined, whereas the powers that are given to the states are numerous and indefinite. The 10th Amendment reserves the powers that are not given to the national government to the state governments. Reserved powers is the powers that are specifically granted. Let's start over. Reserved powers are the powers that are given to the states, and these are the powers that are not given specifically to the federal government, and they are not denied as being state powers, so they are automatically the state's powers, if that makes sense. Powers, state powers can include typically, and they fall into these categories: health, public safety, morals, and general welfare. These are the areas that directly impact people. They impact the day-to-day lives of people. For example, your driver's license, that's something that the state does. They set speed limits. They regulate marriage. They form local government. They conduct elections, right? The state will be the one who conducts the election that we have in November. They control the public school system. They regulate business. They establish and enforce criminal law. They issue licenses, like to doctors and to lawyers, to teachers, to barbers, etc. Now, these are some powers that are shared by both the national and the state government. These are called concurrent powers. We call them shared and concurrent powers. These are the powers that this national government and the state government hold at the same time. Some examples would be collecting taxes, establishing courts, making and enforcing laws, building roads, providing education, borrowing and spending money. Those are examples of shared powers. Now, both the national and the state governments perform these tasks, and they do that at the same time and for the same people. So because they do that for both the same groups of people and at the same time, we the people are subject to two different levels of authority. We have the state's authority and we have the national government's authority. So what happens when national law and state law comes into conflict? The first thing that I think about is the state of Colorado has passed that the use of marijuana is legal, but in the United States, in the federal government, in the federal law, using marijuana in that capacity is illegal. So those two laws have come into conflict. So what happens, right? Article 6 in the Constitution contains the Supremacy Clause, which states that the Constitution, national laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land. It states that judges have to obey the Constitution, even if it contradicts with state law. The Supremacy Clause establishes that national laws are supreme to state laws, as long as the national government is acting within its constitutional limits. So one of the best ways to compare powers is to think about a Venn diagram where you have the national powers on one side and you have the state powers on the other, and then they share powers together. While we've been talking about powers, right, the Constitution also denies powers to the state and national governments. The Bill of Rights and Article 1, Section 9 place limits on the government. Article 1, Section 9 states that the government cannot deny a citizen the right to trial by jury. They cannot grant a title of nobility. They cannot tax exports between states. They cannot pass laws that favor trade of one state over another. They cannot spend money unless it has been authorized by Congress. The Bill of Rights also limits the national government's power because it guarantees that the government cannot interfere with the citizens' basic liberties. Article 1, Section 10 denies specific powers to the states. For example, states cannot coin money, they cannot tax imports and exports from other states, they cannot have their own military. Technically, the National Guard is part of the U.S. military. They cannot separately engage in war, and they cannot enter into treaties with other states and nations. They also cannot pass ex post facto laws, which are laws that are made after the fact. The Constitution also describes the responsibilities that the national government and state governments have toward one another. Article 4, Section 4 states that the national government can only officially recognize representative state governments. The national government is also responsible for protecting the states both from foreign invasion and from domestic uprising. States are to manage affairs within their own borders, and they are to cooperate with one another. States are required to extradite or to return a person that has been charged with a crime to the state in which the offense was committed for prosecution. So, for example, if you commit a crime in the state of Alabama, you cannot just flee to California and expect to not be responsible for your crimes, because California will extradite you back to Alabama. Article 4 contains the full faith and credit clause. This requires that states give full faith and credit to public acts, official records, and judicial proceedings from other states. So in class, I gave the example of, let's say that you want to go to Panama City for spring break, okay? When you get to Florida, you don't have to get a Florida state license to drive through the state. Because of the full faith and credit clause, the state of Florida will recognize your Alabama driver's license. That's part of the full faith and credit clause. Let's say that I get married in the state of Alabama, and for some reason I have to move to Colorado. The state of Colorado would recognize my marriage license because that is part of the full faith and credit clause. Article 4, Section 2 contains the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which specifies that citizens of every state receive all of the privileges and immunities of any state in which they happen to be. For example, if you go to New York City, you still pay New York City's state sales tax, right? Because that's part of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And let's say something happens while you're in New York and you have to call the police, right? The New York City Police Department is not going to ask you, well, are you from the state of Alabama? Sorry, we can't help you. Because under the full Privileges and Immunities Clause, they help you just as if they would somebody who is from the city of New York. The power to create local government is given to the states. Each state's constitution outlines the plan or the process for creating those local governments, and the state can also reorganize local government at any time that they feel that it would better address the state's needs. So, the Constitution does not mention much about Native American nations. The only time that they mention Native American nations is under Article 1, Section 8, where that grants the national government the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. And that generally meant that the national government would make treaties with Native American nations. If you remember from American history, generally the treaties that the Native Americans made with the American government did not work out for them well. They just didn't work out. All right. Yes, that is the last slide for this section. Please make sure that you have completed the section review in Schoology. Y'all have a great day, and I hope this has been helpful.